The Picture of Dorian Gray is a book about a man who manages to live a life of decadent pleasure and not suffer the consequences, because the consequences, by some mysterious process, are legible in a painting of him. The Picture of Dorian Gray was written by Oscar Wilde. It was the only novel he ever wrote. It was published in a magazine called Lippincott, and the editors got rather worried because it's about, in a way, a kind of love triangle between three men. Dorian Gray himself, this beautiful young man, a portrait painter, and a kind of philosopher who believes that beauty and pleasure is what you should spend your life pursuing. It was quite a scandal. The book was part of the reason why Oscar Wilde fell, because in that courtroom where his relationships with men were being investigated, the portrait of Dorian Gray was used as Exhibit A, and they went through that book looking for evidence of his sexual interests, and it's there on those pages. What you've got in the 1890s is a very interesting moment in the history of sexuality. Freedoms that people have had to express themselves sexually are kind of being closed down. And all of this is reflected in Dorian Gray. It's part of an era when sexuality was being medicalised, when people started to think about what they were doing in bed and wondering whether that made them a certain sort of person. We know Dorian Gray does go over to the dark side, but actually it is fantastically appealing. The idea that we can give vent to any desire without suffering the consequences. What John Logan has done very cleverly in Penny Dreadful is saved him slightly from the horrible fate that Oscar Wilde has for him and moved him down a different path. Dorian Gray's a cold, disconnected character, but you get to feel how much he might desire the thing that he really can't have, and that's a warm connection with people outside there in the world. Dracula is a book about something exotic coming from outside and over your threshold. It's really a story about evil personified in the figure of Count Dracula. He's out there beyond the glass of your bedroom window and he wants to come in. Well, Dracula was written by the Irish writer Bram Stoker. Dracula didn't have a huge impact when it was published in 1897. Just after the First World War, there was a touring play version. People who went to see that stage production found something in it that really resonated with them. This was an audience that had been traumatised by the First World War, wanting to gaze upon horror. So it's a huge success at the theatre, and Hollywood latches onto it. When Bela Lugosi walks out, that's the moment when Dracula becomes an immovable part of the culture. There had been vampires before in fiction, but he was usually a repulsive and animal-like creature. What Dracula does is add the idea of love to the myth of the vampire. One of the things that modern readers respond to is that it seems to be about the power of sexuality. This is a book about a man who will come into your bedroom and seduce you. One of the interesting things about Dracula is that it's a very technological book. It's full of the exchange of telegrams and people recording their voices on early recording equipment. Dracula is being pushed to the edge of this book by Victorian technology and rationalism. This evil being, in a way, has no place in the modern world. I think it's absolutely fascinating that there is this short space of time when all of these beings, Dracula, Dorian Gray, loom so large in the canon of fiction. What Penny Dreadful does is it gathers up all of these beings from 19th century Gothic fiction. These figures, they're not just monsters, or at least if they are monsters, they're monsters that we can recognise ourselves in. The novel was published in 1818. It was written by Mary Shelley, who was a teenage girl when she put this book together. The story of Frankenstein and how it was written is extraordinary in itself. Mary Shelley and some of her friends, who included Lord Byron, were staying on the shores of Lake Geneva. It was a summer where it was said that there had been no summer. They challenged each other to come up with a story that would make the hairs on the back of their neck stand up. And Mary Shelley concocted this story about the scientist who creates life out of the bodies of the dead. The main thing that people talked about when Frankenstein came out was who on earth had written it. This was a real good literary mystery. but it was very much attuned to ideas that were in the air at the time. The idea that you could create life out of electricity, that there was something about electricity that might yield the secrets of life. Frankenstein isn't the name of the monster. He's absolutely not a shambling, shuddering beast. He's something else entirely. He is this long-haired creature. He has this kind of tortured quality to him. There's a tremendously moving sequence in it where he's looking through a little crack in the wall at a family living in the forest, just conducting their business. And he's wondering what it would be like to have this ordinary human life. It registers how horrible it is to be an artificial life form. And the reason why Frankenstein is still with us is because we still worry about whether or not we play God when we pursue certain kinds of science. In Penny Dreadful, the creature walks out onto a London street and it's overwhelmed by just the sensory input that it receives. The spices on the market are kind of blazing, the smells, the sensations of that world. It's overwhelming. One of the parts of the story that in a way always has to be there is that idea of an innocent engaging with the world and finding it all incredibly exciting, but you knowing that it's going to be rejected and destroyed by this world.